Good morning. Thank you for coming. This is a press conference hosted by Senator George Young, who is speaking at the City Council and probably will not be able to get here. We are addressing the clemency hearing for James Coddington, which will be next Tuesday before the Pardon and Parole Board, and then his execution is scheduled for August 25th. We have four speakers if Senator Young shows. The first speaker will be Emma Rolls, who is Assistant Federal Public Defender. She's the chief of the Federal Habeas Unit, and she is James Coddington's attorney. She filed a clemency packet for him Friday that I believe you can get online, and that will tell you more of Mr. Coddington's story. Our second speaker, if he shows, will be Senator George Young. Senator Young represents a district in Northeast Oklahoma City, and he's also the interim minister at Greater Mount Carmel Baptist Church. And we're grateful to him for allowing us to use this press room. Third speaker will be Cindy Nguyen, who is policy director for the Oklahoma chapter of the ACLU. And then I will close. I am Don Heath. I'm the chair of the Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And I'm an attorney and a minister. I'm the minister of Edmond Trinity Christian Church in Edmond. Well, let's begin. Emma, would you?
Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you especially to Reverend Heath and Senator and Reverend Dr. George Young for permitting me to have this opportunity to talk to you today about my client, James Coddington, who is scheduled to be executed by the state of Oklahoma on August 25th. I have been representing people on Oklahoma's death row a long time. I've committed my career to that. And I can say without hesitation that James Coddington is the most deeply and sincerely remorseful person I have ever represented. He is not the same man who killed Albert Hale almost 25 years ago, and it would be profoundly unjust to execute him now. James did not get much of a chance at life. He was born to alcoholic and drug-addicted parents. When he was just a few weeks old, his mother was sent to prison, and he was left in the care of his violent and alcoholic father. When James was just a baby, his father and his older brothers put whiskey and beer in his baby bottles, and they did this for two reasons. They did this to get him to stop crying, but they also did it for the amusement of their friends because they thought it was funny the way an infant acted when he was intoxicated. James grew up in abject poverty in Mulligan Flats, which was once the most economically depressed and poorest neighborhood in Oklahoma City. He grew up in almost uninhabitable homes with dirt floors, broken out windows, and no indoor plumbing. He was surrounded by drugs and violence. And although the adults in his life always found a way to get alcohol and drugs, they could not provide for the basic needs for James. They couldn't even provide food. And when there was no food in the house, James was forced to eat from dumpsters behind fast food restaurants when he was just a boy. In addition to his early exposure to drugs and alcohol, James was brutalized at the hands of his alcoholic father. It was not uncommon for his father to beat him with a belt, leaving welts all over his tiny body and drawing blood. He was kicked out of a stroller. He was frequently thrown against walls, thrown from the porch of his house. And this was a day-to-day occurrence for James, and this was all before the age of 3. James' father abandoned him when he was 7 years old. The abuse, the neglect, and the trauma resulted in James being placed in a psychiatric unit at OU Children's Medical Hospital when he was 8. He was there for 6 months. And while he was receiving the therapeutic care he desperately needed, he flourished, he excelled, he grew, and he made extraordinary progress, as is documented in the medical records provided in Mr. Coddington's clemency packet. But when he was released against medical advice to the custody of his mother, when she just became released from prison herself, James was again exposed to more chaos, neglect, and abuse. His mother was a methamphetamine user, dealer, and manufacturer, and she was surrounded by customers and those and people struggling with addiction, and James was exposed to that as well. All of the progress that James made while he was in the therapeutic care at the OU Adolescent Center was erased. Under these circumstances, I think it's hardly surprising that James succumbed to addiction. By age 7, he was already huffing paint. By age 11, his older brothers had introduced him to cocaine. And by 15, he was already strung out on cocaine, mainlining the drug after his older brothers told him and taught him how to properly shoot up. I want us to stop and really think about what this means. What does that mean that a child as young as 7 has to resort to using drugs? And I would submit it was to escape the day-to-day horrors of his life, and he was also mirroring the behaviors of those adults who were entrusted to take care of him. And it is this addiction that ultimately led to the murder of Mr. Hale. James is absolutely devastated and ashamed by what he did to Mr. Hale. He has unflinchingly accepted responsibility for taking Mr. Hale's life. He confessed to the crime, he led police to the weapon, and he testified at his trial taking full responsibility. But recognizing he cannot undo his actions, James has worked every day since to be the best prisoner he can and be the best person he can and help everyone around him and everyone he comes in contact with. He has earned the trust and respect of prison guards, and they have allowed him to hold the one job that death row prisoners can hold, and it is a coveted position. He is the unit orderly, which means he assists the staff in all of the tasks that they need. It's a trusted position. He distributes food, he paints the unit, and he cleans. And he's done this upholding the highest behavioral standards. He has earned his GED, and he devotes much of his time and his energy to provide guidance and support to his family, his friends, his loved ones, and his fellow prisoners. You don't have to believe my words. I'm his advocate. All you have to do is look at James's DOC records for the last 15 years, and those speak for themselves. And a former Oklahoma Department Corrections Director and 2 former correctional officers offered statements in James' behalf, and they attest to his good character, his respectable demeanor, and his outstanding behavioral record. The death penalty is supposed to be reserved for the very worst of the worst murderers. James Coddington is not that. He is a changed man. He is a mature, caring, hardworking, and respectful prisoner, and he adds value to the community in which he lives behind bars. We are asking for mercy for James Coddington. We fervently hope the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board and Governor Stitt will grant him the clemency that he deserves. Thank you.
If you would hold your questions until the end.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cindy Nguyen. I am the Policy Director for the ACLU of Oklahoma, CINDYNGUYEN. Oklahoma is about to embark on a cruel, inhumane, and reckless execution spree yet again. This current rush to return, led by unelected Attorney General John O'Connor, is especially worrisome considering the lack of transparency around the execution protocol, and the former botched execution highlighted the incompetence as well as the inhumanity of the entire process. Time and time again, it has been proven that the criminal legal system fails to protect many Oklahomans. If sending people to prisons to be executed kept our community safe, then we would be the safest place in the world. And yet we do not see that. Instead, we continue to rank first in the nation for adverse childhood experiences. James Coddington, like many children in Oklahoma, experienced profound abuse, poverty, addiction, and trauma throughout his entire childhood. Death sentences are not predicted based on the heinousness of the crime, but by the quality of the defense, the race of the accused and the victim, and the state in which the crime occurred. Oklahoma has done absolutely nothing to inspire the confidence that they are now able to successfully exercise the ultimate power of any government. Every Oklahoman must ask themselves not whether they individually support the death penalty, but rather, do they trust our current government with the power to kill its own citizens? The death penalty is racist, it is arbitrary, it is costly, and it is error-prone. Our criminal justice system cannot be made fail-safe because it is run by human beings who are fallible. It is time that we end the death penalty once and for all. Thank you.
You can't change people's minds about moral issues with a rational argument. You need to be able to tell stories of the inmates on death row, and that is our mission at the Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, is to get the stories of the inmates out and humanize them. I met with Julius Jones in the summer of 2018 before the documentary came out and at H Unit, and all he could talk about was getting his story out. His story got out, and look what a difference it made. Today we're trying to get the story of James Coddington out. And one of the problems with the death penalty in Oklahoma is that the state frames the story. And the media outlets and the newspapers generally accept the state's frame. The inmate's story is never told. So today we would like, Emma has beautifully told James Coddington's story. She'll have 45 minutes next Tuesday morning at the Pardon and Parole Board hearing to go into more detail on the story. One of the elders in my church visited with Donald Grant, who was executed in January. She talked to him on the phone, she wrote him letters, and she visited him in person. And her son asked her, "Why do you do that? Why do you waste your time with that?" And she told him Donald Grant's story, which is much like James Coddington's story. They're two horrific stories. And after listening to that story, her son said, "Well, he didn't have a chance, did he?" Justice is not killing an inmate for the victim's family. That's what we hear from the attorney generals over and over. That's what justice is. That is vengeance. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "No more eye for an eye." Dr. King said, "Violence begets violence." That's the moral standard that we aspire to. Justice takes place when a person is held accountable for their actions. Justice was achieved when James Coddington was pronounced guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Albert Hale. He pled guilty, and the trial was about what his sentence would be. He has served 25 years in prison, the last 19 years on death row. He was 25 years old when he went into prison. He will die in prison. He's asking for his sentence to be commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will still be accountable for his crimes. Life without parole, I believe, is also cruel and unusual punishment. No hope of getting out. But we can go further into that another day. The focus of the Clemency petition is mercy and forgiveness. We have a retributive justice system in Oklahoma. There have been few and tentative steps toward restorative justice. Rex Friend here is one of the practitioners of restorative justice in Oklahoma City. If we're going to have retributive justice, mercy is an essential element. Mercy is compassion or forgiveness towards someone whom you have the power to punish. It's particularly appropriate when someone has shown repentance and asked for forgiveness, as Mr. Coddington has. Repentance means two things. It means turning your life around and remorse for your sins. The Pardon and Parole Board will judge next week whether his repentance is sincere. God sees every person as a beloved child of God. The state sees Coddington, at least in its packet, as an evil psychopath. He deserves to die. That's the state's frame. Are we the Bible Belt or the death belt? Why would God show mercy to a murderer? Because God is like that. Look at the biblical witness. Look at the murderers in the Bible stories. Cain murdered his brother, and God protected Cain and said, "No harm shall come to him." And Cain went on to found the first city. Moses killed a man. God sent him into the wilderness and protected him and brought him back to be the leader of the Hebrew people. He led the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. David committed adultery with his general's wife and then asked the other military leaders to expose the general in combat so the general would be killed. David, Israel's greatest king, was a murderer. But he was remorseful and pious, and God found a use for King David. In the New Testament, Paul, by some translations, killed early followers of Christ. Paul had a calling from God, and God found a use for his life as an apostle to the Gentiles. We have a harsh criminal justice system. Oklahoma has the highest execution rate in the country. Oklahoma has the second highest rate of mass incarceration in the country, and that's after releasing as many nonviolent offenders as we possibly can. Why are our sentences so harsh? Are Oklahomans more evil than people in other states? What have Oklahomans done to deserve such harsh punishment? There are many reasons, but I suggest to you that a leading reason is that we have harsh district attorneys. Coddington's crime took place during Bob Macy's reign. Oklahoma County is one of the 5 deadliest counties in the country. Tarrant County and Dallas County are 2 other ones. If Oklahoma County were a state, it would have the 10th highest number of executions since 1976. Mercy becomes more important when we recognize that the system is broken. Mercy is a check on the system. No matter how many jury deliberations there have been, no matter how many court proceedings there have been, the standard of proof shifts dramatically the other direction once sentence is pronounced. The jury found that Mr. Coddington is a continuing threat to society. I would submit the Pardon and Parole Board is in a better position 27 years later to judge that. The Pardon and Parole Board will have the advantage of looking at Mr. Coddington's life in the 27 years since he killed Albert Hale. The state, in its packet, looks only at the man who committed the crime in 1997, and 98% of the state's packet is a recreation of that crime. Is James Coddington still the same man? Does God believe that James Coddington's life has value? Ask yourself, if I had faced the same obstacles that James Coddington faced growing up, would I have done any better? Could I have survived 25 years on death row and improved myself, gotten a GED, been a model prisoner? It's hard for us to accept God's gift of mercy to another person. We say, they don't deserve it. Does anyone deserve mercy? That's the whole point. We forgive the trespasses of others in hopes that our trespasses will be forgiven. That's the prayer we say every Sunday. James Coddington has had a tragic life. The greatest tragedy in his life was when he killed Albert Hale, his friend. Now the state wants to compound that tragedy with another tragedy, as if killing James Coddington in our name will somehow bring justice to Oklahoma. We plead with the Pardon and Parole Board to show mercy to James Coddington. And we will stand for questions. Emma, there are some areas that Ms. Rolls can't get into, but go ahead and try.
So Ms. Rolls, based on your presentation for this clemency hearing, you're going to tell his story for 45 minutes. Some are going to say, well, people are abused routinely, unfortunately, but not everyone, they carry out an action like this, an action was murder. How would you respond to that?
Well, my response to that is that while other people might not have taken such horrific steps, I agree with you. I don't want to ever minimize what Mr. Coddington did. Usually, even with the people who have such tragic circumstances, they have that one person, the one person who cares, whether it be a coach, a sibling, a minister. James had nothing. Every single person in his family, and I would mind you that most of his brothers ended up incarcerated for drug-related crimes. He cannot undo what he did. And I never want to speak for Mr. Hale's family, and I can't even begin to imagine their grief. But James is so much more than what he did that day. And that would be my response to that question.
How is Mr. Coddington doing right now, and is he planning on addressing the board next week?
He will address the board, and he's understandably scared and anxious.
Do you all have a plan if the clemency is denied?
There is potential litigation on the lethal injection case, and that's as far as I'm willing to share.
The Pardon and Parole Board often asks, as you know, whether the inmate has reached out to the family. Has Mr. Coddington reached out to Mr. Hale's family at all?
When pre-trial, Mr. Coddington's trial attorney in the late 90s, Tamara Spradlin, did in fact reach out to Mr. Hale's family and asked if they'd be willing to sit down with a mediator to talk about what happened, and James would be willing to do that and talk with them, and that offer was rejected.
How common or uncommon is it for corrections officers and a former DOC director to support a clemency petition?
I think it's very uncommon. And I want to be clear, none of the two correctional officers and the former director did not specifically say Mr. Coddington should be granted clemency. I don't want to be accused of putting words in their mouth. But they described his behavior, they described his good conduct, his respectful demeanor, and that he was very unlike many of the other prisoners with whom the guards interacted.
Was Mr. Jones paid for his opinion?
No, he was not.
I have a question more so for Mr. Heath. So there are 25 death row inmates set to be executed in the next 2.5 years. Do you plan to fight for them in a similar way that you're fighting for James?
Absolutely. We will resist each and every one of the executions. We'll attend every Pardon and Parole Board hearing. We'll do what we can to get each and every one of those 25 men's story out. We'll hold a vigil for them if the execution actually goes through. We'll try to visit them if they want to be visited. All 25 men are beloved children of God.
Reverend, we have some Republicans who were on board even in this building via the Glossop case on death penalty reform, or Kevin McDougal said he'd support abolishing the death penalty if they kill Richard Glossop. Are you hopeful that there's some kind of tide change, or that anything could happen in terms of death penalty reform or abolition?
Of course, I hope Oklahomans are horrified at the prospect of executing 25 men over the next 29 months. We will have more executions in Oklahoma than the rest of the country combined, if that's what we do. I believe you can check death penalty information to confirm the statistics, but I believe that the United States is the only country in the Western Hemisphere that has executed anyone in the last 10 years. Most of the rest of the Western Hemisphere is Catholic, and it violates Catholic social teaching to execute people. That the Catholics in this building have not seemed to follow that teaching, but the Catholics in the rest of the Western Hemisphere have.
Mr. Coddington have a spiritual advisor yet? If you can say.
I cannot say. I know that Mr. Coddington is a man of faith, and through some friends, he has a prayer group, but I don't believe he has an actual spiritual advisor with whom he visits on a regular basis.
He has a fiance?
He does.
For both of you.
And she's actually here today in support of Mr. Coddington.
For both of you, how hopeful are you that this clemency petition will be successful, both with the Pardon and Parole Board, and if they vote in Mr. Coddington's favor, then in Governor's state?
I'm always hopeful, and that's why I keep doing this job for 22 years.
When I read Donald Grant's packet and Gilbert Postel's packet, I thought this will be unanimous, 5-0, and it was 1-4. And the one has resigned since then, and the other, Kelly Doyle, has also resigned. We have 2 new members. One of them was a former prosecutor. We already have another prosecutor on the Pardon and Parole Board. This Pardon and Parole Board hearing will tell a lot. Because this is a really strong case for mercy and forgiveness. Governor Stitt still has to follow through on that recommendation. You know, I'm hopeful, but you know, it's in his hands. But that will tell us a lot about how the rest of the clemency hearings are going to go when we see how this one goes.
I'd like to correct one thing stated earlier by by Reverend Heath, and that was that James actually did have a first stage at trial. He did not plead guilty. He testified and accepted responsibility, and his initial wish was to enter a blind plea, and I documented that in his clemency packet as evidenced by a report from a psychologist who evaluated him. But he did go to trial and had a first stage.
Sorry.
It's fine. I just wanted to make sure that it was accurate.
You said at the start of your statement that you've never seen anybody as remorseful as him in your 20, how many years?
I've been practicing capital defense law off and on for 22 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is that it? Well, thank you for attending, and we'll see you next Tuesday morning at the Cape Bernard Center for the clemency hearing.